On this day in history, July 11th, 1897, Solomon August Andrée heads off on a North Pole exploration by hydrogen balloon. This was an age of polar exploration and new engineering marvels. Andrée was a 43-year-old working in the Swedish Patent Office and was Sweden's first balloonist. He was also kind of an engineer, physicist, aeronaut, and polar explorer. And I say kind of because after hearing the rest of the story, he really wasn't very good at any of those things. So he proposed a voyage by hydrogen balloon that would leave Svalbard, which is north of Norway, and head towards either Russia or Canada, passing over the North Pole as he went. His idea was enthusiastically received by the people of Sweden, who had fallen behind the rest of the world in polar exploration. Andrée gave a lecture in 1895 to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and convinced the audience that the Arctic summer was uniquely suitable for ballooning. The midnight sun would allow observations around the clock, thereby cutting the voyage time in half. He said that minimal precipitation in the area posed no threat of weighing down the balloon, and if any rain or snow did fall on the balloon at above freezing temperatures, it would melt. And at below freezing temperatures, it would just blow off because the balloon would be traveling slower than the wind. The audience was convinced by his arguments because no one really knew what Arctic summers were like. They didn't know that they were actually prone to summer storms, fogs, high humidity, and the ever-present threat of ice on an aircraft. Andrée was Sweden's first balloonist, so no one knew enough to second-guess him. However, France and Germany weren't exactly noobs to the ballooning game, and they expressed a lot of skepticism about his methods and research. However, any objections failed to dampen Andrée's enthusiasm. Andrée ignored a lot of the early signs of danger associated with his plan. Drag ropes essentially hang out of the basket and drag on the ground, and are designed to slow the balloon down enough where you can steer by sails. However, drag ropes are prone to snapping, falling off, getting tangled up with each other, getting caught on bushes, trees, animals, and aren't considered to be an effective steering technique by any modern balloonist. To make matters worse, the polar balloon was delivered directly from the manufacturer in Paris without being tested. When measurements showed that it was leaking more than expected, Andrée failed to acknowledge this. The balloon had to be specifically designed to accommodate 3 adults in a small balloon basket for about 30 days. The sleeping berths were fitted at the floor, and there was room for the provisions on top. The balloon was made out of hydrogen, which is extremely flammable, so that meant that cooking couldn't be done in the basket. A special kerosene stove was developed, designed to be dangled 26 feet below the basket, and the crew would use an angled mirror attached to the stove to determine whether it had been successfully lit or not. So they're just cooking away down there 26 feet below their balloon. As launch day approached, Andrée chose his crew: a 27-year-old civil engineer, Knut Frankel, and 25-year-old Nils Strindberg, a student of physics and chemistry, and an amateur photographer. All 3 guys were more or less the indoor type, but Andrée expected a sedentary voyage in a balloon basket, so strength and survival skills were pretty far down on his list of requirements. During a buoyancy test, the team was pretty skeptical about the balloon's ability to retain hydrogen. They didn't think it would make it to the North Pole, let alone Russia or Canada. But, of course, Andrée refused to accept this, and they later found out that he was secretly pumping hydrogen back into the balloon to throw off the tests and swing the data more in his favor. You little stinker. On July 11th, the 3 explorers climbed into the already heavy basket and cut the tether ropes. The balloon moved out so low over the water that it actually dipped down into the ocean a couple times. The crew dropped over 1,100 pounds of rope and almost 500 pounds of sand within the first few minutes of the voyage, enabling the balloon to lift a little higher into the air. Without the extra weight, the balloon lifted up to 2,300 feet, which was a much higher altitude than expected, and the lower air pressure made the hydrogen escape even faster through over 8 million stitching holes. The balloon traveled for 2 days and 3.5 hours in total, before finally becoming permanently grounded on a large patch of ice somewhere in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. The men were safe, but stranded. The balloon had been stocked with a lot of safety equipment like guns, skis, sleds, tents, and even a boat, which was actually just a bundle of sticks that was meant to be shimmied together and covered in the silk of the balloon. And the men weren't dressed appropriately, of course. They weren't wearing any fur, just some woolen coats and some oilskin cloth, which was like waterproof, something that a sailor would wear. The men spent about a week at the crash site packing up and deciding where to go next. The North Pole was ruled out, so the choice was between two depots that had been stocked with food and ammunition for their safety. Inferring wrongly from their faulty maps that the depots were about equal distance apart, they decided to head towards the bigger depot, which was, of course, further away. They had originally packed 53 gallons of water, some crates of champagne, port, and beer, which had been donated by sponsors and manufacturers, some canned meat, sausages, cheese, condensed milk. So they loaded it all up. Everyone had their own sled, but now the sleds weighed over 440 pounds, which was way too heavy for the men to carry. The sleds kept breaking down, and the guys were just exhausted. So they had to dump most of it. I think they got their weight down to like 290 pounds. So they head out east on July 22nd. But they're on a big patch of ice floating in the ocean. So as they're headed east, guess what? The ice patch is floating west. So they're actually going backwards. When they realize this, well, they just turn around and they start heading the other way. But the winds up in the Arctic kept switching directions, so now they're heading this way and they're still being pushed back the opposite direction. They've made like no progress at all. This went on for 2 months until on September 12th, the explorers just gave up, decided to make up camp, stay where they're at, and let the ice just float them where it would, which, as one explorer put in his diary, had pretty much been happening the whole time. However, wouldn't you know it, the ice floe begins to break up right under their hut. And so they load up what little supplies they can into their little stick boat, and they float towards the nearest piece of land, which was like a 2-day journey. The final pages of Andre's diary were dated October 8th. It read, "It feels fine to be sleeping on fast land as opposed to the drifting ice." It's believed that the 3 men died shortly after. For the next 33 years, the fate of the expedition was a mystery. Finally, on August 5th, 1930, the remains were found by a Norwegian expedition studying glaciers and the Arctic Sea. The bodies of the 3 men were returned to Sweden and cremated without further examination, so we really don't know for sure how they died. Of course, there are theories. It's believed that Strindberg, the youngest, died first. He was buried by being wedged into the side of a cliff by his buddies. After examining his ripped underpants, which he was buried wearing, and was examined in 1930, it's believed that at least Strindberg was killed by a polar bear. The bear attack possibly also injured his buddy Frankel, who died shortly thereafter in the tent, wearing no mittens and no shoes. Andre, finding himself trapped on the island and not being able to leave by himself, possibly decided to commit suicide by morphine, which was provided in the first aid supplies. This theory is supported by the fact that his remains were found in kind of an upright position with his rifle by his side and nearly empty bottles of morphine all around him. In addition, his diary had been neatly wrapped in a sweater and balloon silk, indicating that he was hoping it would be preserved and found later. When they were found, the explorers were celebrated for their doomed heroism and were seen as having selflessly perished for the ideals of science and exploration. However, as more information about the doomed exploration came out, Andre's heroism was called into question, as he ignored multiple warnings about errors in his research, faulty equipment, faking tests, and a total lack of preparedness. Remind you of anyone? Instead, he might have been motivated by his desire to make a name for himself, and didn't have the courage to admit defeat when his reputation was at stake. In contrast, appreciation for Strindberg's role has grown in recent years, for the fortitude in which an untrained and unprepared student kept on taking pictures despite the probably near constant state of exhaustion and exposure, and the artistic quality of his photos. Out of the 240 exposed frames in waterlogged containers, 93 were saved by the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Strindberg's former workplace. This guy Andre was financed by King Oscar of Sweden and Alfred Nobel of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he had garnered a lot of worldwide media attention. So you got a guy who doesn't want to hear he's wrong, with too much money to spend, and everyone's looking at him, and he doesn't want to embarrass himself, and he ends up putting people's lives at risk because of stupid errors, miscalculations, and just being stubborn. Damn shame. Damn shame. Crazy story. Well, that's the story of the Andre expedition to the North Pole. Not a happy ending. The idea that you would travel to the North Pole in a hydrogen balloon just sounds crazy. I mean, when I read that fact, I was like, I gotta read this story. I gotta know more. And it was actually crazier and more devastating than I expected. Have a great day.